She dragged a dying outlaw into her cabin, but at sunrise, $5,000 bounty hunters surrounded her home. The valley had been quiet for most of the day. But by evening, the sky began to change. Thick gray clouds rolled over the mountains and swallowed the last light of the sun. The wind picked up slowly at first, then stronger, bending the tall grass and rattling the wooden fence around the small cabin. Eliza Harper stood at her window, watching the storm gather. She had lived alone in that cabin for 3 years now. It sat far from town, surrounded by pine trees and rough land that most people avoided. The cabin was simple: one main room with a fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed near the back wall. There was also a barn a short distance away where she kept her mule and stored hay. She liked the quiet. After her husband passed away in a mining accident, the silence had felt heavy at first. Every corner of the cabin reminded her of him. His boots once stood by the door. His laughter once filled the evenings, but with time the silence had become her shield. It protected her from gossip, from pity, and from the noise of a world that had not been kind. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Eliza wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. She needed to secure the barn door before the rain came down. The air smelled sharp and cold, and the wind tugged at her long brown hair, pulling it loose from the ribbon at her neck. The first drops of rain were heavy and cold. They hit the ground with force, turning dust into mud in seconds. She hurried toward the barn, her boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. Lightning flashed across the sky, bright and sudden, lighting up the valley like a camera flash. For a brief second, she could see the outline of the trees against the dark mountains. She fastened the barn door tightly and turned to head back to the cabin. That was when she heard it. At first, she thought it was thunder echoing across the hills. But then it came again, a faint, strained sound. It was not the wind, it was not the storm. It was the weak cry of a horse. Eliza froze. The sound came from beyond the tree line, near the narrow trail that led toward town. No one traveled that path during a storm unless they had no choice. Her heart began to beat faster. She told herself it was none of her business. Whoever it was could handle their own trouble. She had learned to stay away from problems. Life had taught her that helping sometimes brought more pain than peace. But the sound came again, softer this time. She could not ignore it. Pulling her shawl tighter, she stepped into the rain and moved toward the trees. Mud clung to her boots and branches scratched at her sleeves as she pushed forward. The storm grew stronger. Thunder cracked loudly overhead, and lightning lit the path ahead of her in sharp flashes. When she reached the edge of the trees, she saw a dark shape on the ground. Another flash of lightning revealed the scene clearly. A horse lay on its side, breathing heavily, its legs tangled beneath it. A few feet away, a man lay face down in the mud. For a moment, Eliza could not move. The storm roared around her, but all she could hear was her own heartbeat. She stepped closer carefully. The horse was alive, but too weak to stand. Its saddle was torn, and one of its reins had snapped. The man beside it was motionless. Eliza knelt beside him and turned him over with effort. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue from the cold rain. Dark hair clung to his forehead. His coat was soaked, and when her hand brushed against his side, she felt something warm despite the rain. Blood. She pulled her hand back quickly. Another flash of lightning revealed his face clearly. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized him. Even though she had only seen his face once before on a worn paper nailed outside the general store, there was no mistake. The sharp jawline, the small scar near his left eyebrow, Daniel Reed. His name had been spoken in low voices around town for months. People said he robbed stagecoaches. Some claimed he had cheated wealthy landowners. Others whispered that he was running from powerful men. There was a bounty on him, $5,000, a fortune large enough to change someone's life. Eliza stared down at him, her mind racing. $5,000. That money could repair her cabin roof. It could buy better land. It could secure her future so she would never struggle through another winter. All she had to do was leave him there. The storm would finish what the injury had started. No one would know she had found him, but as she looked at his face, she saw something unexpected. He did not look like the cold criminal described in town. He looked young, tired, human. He let out a faint groan. His eyes opened slightly, unfocused and confused. For a brief second, they met hers. There was no threat in them, only pain. "Help!" he whispered, barely audible over the storm. The word was weak, almost lost in the wind. Eliza's chest tightened. She remembered another night years ago. A night when men had carried her husband home from the mine. Injured, broken, she had begged for help then. She had prayed someone would do more, act faster, care more, but no one had. Now she was the one standing over someone who might not survive the night. The storm did not wait for her decision. Rain poured harder, soaking them both. Daniel's breathing became shallow. "If I help you," she murmured softly, almost to herself, "I risk everything." But leaving him felt worse. With a deep breath, she slid her arms under his shoulders and tried to lift him. He was heavier than she expected. Mud made it harder to get a grip. She nearly slipped once, but she steadied herself. "Stay awake," she said firmly, though she was not sure he could hear her. She dragged him slowly across the wet ground, step by step, toward the cabin. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Her muscles burned. Rain blinded her eyes. The storm seemed to fight her every move. At one point, she almost stopped. She looked back at the trees, at the fallen horse. What was she doing? Bringing a wanted man into her home could destroy her life. If bounty hunters were tracking him, they might not be far behind. If the sheriff found out she had hidden him, she could face serious consequences. But she kept moving. Finally, they reached the cabin porch. With great effort, she pulled him inside and shut the door against the storm. The sudden quiet felt strange after the roaring wind. The room smelled of wood smoke and damp clothes. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, but she quickly added logs and stirred the embers until flames rose again. Daniel lay unconscious on her wooden floor. She stood over him, breathing heavily, staring at the stranger she had just chosen to save. "There's no turning back now," she whispered. She removed his soaked coat carefully and saw the wound clearly. The injury on his side was serious but not hopeless. The bleeding had slowed slightly, though it was still dangerous. Eliza moved quickly. She heated water, gathered clean cloth, and brought out the small wooden box of medical supplies she had kept since her husband's days in the mine. He had taught her basic treatment skills for injuries, knowing how common accidents were. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the wound. Daniel stirred and groaned but did not wake fully. She worked with steady focus, pushing aside fear and doubt. Outside, thunder shook the cabin walls. Inside, Eliza fought to keep a stranger alive. Every few minutes she paused to listen for sounds beyond the storm. Hoofbeats, voices, anything. There was nothing, just the storm and the crackling fire. As she pressed a clean cloth against his side, she realized something strange. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt alive with urgency, with purpose. She did not know who Daniel Reed truly was. She did not know if the stories were true or false. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing clearly. Tonight she had made her choice, and by morning that choice might change everything. The storm outside began to soften as dawn approached. Rain still fell in steady sheets, but the wind lost some of its fury. Inside the small cabin, Eliza Harper worked tirelessly, her hands raw and tired from treating the stranger's injuries. Daniel Reed, still unconscious, lay on the floor, wrapped in a dry blanket she had pulled from the corner. His face was pale and shallow breaths rose and fell unevenly. Every so often he twitched, and she feared that his strength might not last the night. She paused for a moment, leaning against the table to catch her breath. Her mind raced. How had she gotten herself into this situation? A wanted man, a bounty on his head, a stranger whose life depended entirely on her now. She thought of the townsfolk who would gossip for hours if they knew she had let a criminal into her home. But those thoughts faded quickly as she looked at him again. His chest rose and fell slightly, and a small flicker of hope sparked in her heart. She gathered the clean cloths and warm water she had prepared, carefully returning to Daniel. His wound was serious, deep enough that it could easily become infected. She cleaned it again, applied salve, and wrapped it gently. Each movement required caution. She could not afford to hurt him more. His eyes fluttered open briefly, confused and unfocused, but closed again almost immediately. "Eliza," a weak voice whispered. She froze. His eyes opened slowly, hazy with pain and exhaustion. His lips were pale, and his voice barely rose above the crackle of the fire. Where am I?" he asked, his words trembling. "You're safe," she said softly, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "You're in my cabin. The storm caught you and I brought you inside. You're badly hurt, but you'll live if we're careful." He tried to sit up, but a sharp wince of pain made him lean back. Why?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Why would you help me?" Eliza shook her head slowly, pulling another blanket from the corner to make him more comfortable. Because no one deserves to die alone in the rain, she said, her voice steady despite the fear and adrenaline that still pulsed through her. It doesn't matter what people say about you. You're human and I won't leave you to die. Daniel looked at her, his eyes flickering with surprise and something she could not quite read, perhaps gratitude, perhaps disbelief. You don't know who I am, he murmured. I know enough, she replied. I know there are people who will pay money to see you dead. But I also know that most of the stories are only half-truths. You're hurt, that's enough for me. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the wall. I thank you, he whispered. I don't know how I can repay you. You don't need to, she said quickly, forcing a small smile despite her worry. Just stay alive, that's enough. The hours passed slowly. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words she could not understand. Eliza kept the fire burning and continued tending his wound, cleaning it and checking for signs of infection. She made him sip small amounts of water from a tin cup, careful not to let him choke. Every so often, she adjusted the blanket to keep him warm and watched him sleep, praying silently that he would survive until help came, or until he was strong enough to move. As the storm cleared, the valley outside began to show signs of dawn. Light filtered through the mist, casting a pale gray glow over the forest and cabin. For a moment the quiet felt almost peaceful, though the tension inside the cabin remained thick. Finally, Daniel stirred more noticeably. He blinked, his eyes still clouded with pain. Eliza, he asked again, voice stronger but still weak. Is it morning? Yes, she replied softly. The storm is passing, you're safe for now, try to rest. He nodded, but instead of lying back down, he struggled to sit up. His movement was slow and deliberate, as though every motion caused him pain. Eliza moved quickly to support him. Careful, she warned. You're not ready to stand yet. I need to explain, he said, his voice raspy. You deserve to know the truth. Eliza sat beside him, brushing damp strands of hair from her face to clear her vision. Go on, she said. He took a deep breath, wincing as he did. I didn't start out this way, he began. I wasn't always wanted. There was a man, a powerful investor in town, who took land from farmers, cheated them, and hurt families. I tried to expose him. I tried to stop the corruption, but it cost me everything. He spread stories, made it seem like I was a criminal, a robber. And now the law and men who just want the bounty, they're after me. Eliza listened carefully, her heart tightening. She had seen the same kind of injustice herself. Her husband had died in a mining accident that should have been prevented, but the owners of the mine faced no consequences. The law had turned a blind eye. She understood too well how power and money could twist the truth. So you didn't steal from people who couldn't afford it? She asked quietly. He shook his head. No, I only took from the corrupt, but now everyone thinks I'm the villain. She leaned back, absorbing his words. The fire crackled between them, and outside the storm had almost vanished. The valley smelled of wet earth and pine. Despite the calm, Eliza knew that danger was coming. The bounty hunters would not wait forever. If they discovered him in her cabin, they would not hesitate. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I need help, he admitted, and because I trust you. She looked at him, unsure whether to believe him. Trust was not something she gave lightly, and yet there was a strange honesty in his eyes, a vulnerability that could not be faked. She could see that he was weak, injured, and completely dependent on her. And she realized that her choice to help him had created a responsibility she could not ignore. Over the next hours, they talked in fragments. Daniel told her about the days before the storm, how he had been ambushed by men on horseback, how he had fled into the mountains, and how he had hoped to make it to safety. Eliza shared a little of her own story, not about her loss, but about living alone in the cabin, surviving in the quiet, finding small moments of peace amidst a world that had not been kind. Despite their differences, a connection began to form. It was not a romantic connection, though there was a quiet respect between them. It was a bond forged in necessity and humanity, a bond that came from seeing the other at their most vulnerable. Daniel tried to stand again, using the cabin wall for support. His injury protested and he nearly fell. Eliza caught him just in time. You're still too weak, she warned. You have to rest. I can't stay here forever, he said, his voice strained. I know the bounty hunters, they'll come for me. They might, she admitted. But if they do, we'll handle it. For now you survive, that's all that matters. The morning light grew stronger, shining through the small cabin windows. Outside, the valley looked calm, almost peaceful. Birds had begun to sing again, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief after the storm. But inside the cabin, the tension remained. Every noise outside, the rustle of leaves, a distant bird, even the sound of water dripping from the roof, made Eliza's heart race. She knew that the world outside was still dangerous. For Daniel, the danger was not just the bounty. It was every man who had been sent to find him, every lawman who believed the stories about him, every person who could mistake him for a criminal without knowing the truth. And yet in that small cabin, with the warmth of the fire and the quiet care of Eliza Harper, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in months: safety. He looked at her, struggling to sit up straighter, and said, "I don't know how I can repay you. You've saved my life." "You don't need to repay me," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Just stay alive, that's enough." He nodded slowly, closing his eyes again. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest fully, trusting the woman who had chosen to help him. Eliza sat nearby, tending to him, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She knew that the coming days would be difficult. Bounty hunters would likely arrive at her cabin. She would need to be clever, cautious, and ready. But for now, she focused on the small victories, keeping him alive, keeping the fire warm, and keeping hope alive in a world that had so little of it. As the morning sun rose higher over the mountains, it cast long shadows across the cabin floor. The warmth of the sunlight mixed with the heat from the fire, creating a strange sense of calm. In that moment, the storm outside felt far away, and for a brief time, the world seemed manageable. Daniel stirred again, opening his eyes slowly. He looked around, noticing the small cabin details, the worn table, the fire, the stacks of blankets, and his gaze fell on Eliza. "You've really helped me," he whispered. She smiled softly, brushing her hair from her face. "We all need help sometimes," she said. "Even someone like you?" He managed a weak laugh, the first in days, and she felt a small relief in her chest. The danger was not gone, but the first hurdle had been crossed. Daniel Reed was still alive, and that was enough for now. Outside, the valley basked in the soft morning light, unaware of the choices being made in the small cabin that could change the course of more than one life. Inside, two strangers, one a woman who had known loss, the other a man who had known danger, sat together, bound by a quiet understanding and the fragile hope that they could survive what the coming days would bring. The morning stretched on, each hour slower than the last, filled with quiet conversations, careful movements, and the ever-present fire crackling at the heart of the cabin. Outside, the world had calmed after the storm. Inside, life fought to continue, fragile but determined. And for Eliza Harper and Daniel Reed, the day had only just begun. The morning sun had climbed higher into the sky, casting soft, golden light across the valley. The storm had passed completely, leaving the air crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of wet pine and earth. The calm, however, was deceptive. Inside the small cabin, tension filled the room like a heavy fog, because both Eliza Harper and Daniel Reed knew that the peace outside was fragile. Daniel had regained some strength overnight, but he still moved slowly. Every step caused pain. Every shift of his injured side reminded him of his vulnerability. He sat near the fireplace, carefully sipping water that Eliza handed him in a small tin cup. The warmth of the cabin and the comforting crackle of the fire gave him a strange sense of security, yet the thought of the bounty hunters outside made his chest tighten. Eliza had been on edge all morning. She moved quietly around the cabin, checking the windows and door, making sure everything was secure. Her hands, though steady from years of managing the household, trembled slightly as she thought about what could happen. She knew that bounty hunters did not care about law or mercy. They were after money, and they would not hesitate to harm her or Daniel to get it. She glanced at Daniel, who had just attempted to stand. "Careful," she warned. "You're not ready yet." "I have to try," he said, his voice firm but strained. "If they come, I need to be able to move. I can't let them take me while I'm weak." Eliza studied him, her brow furrowed. She admired his courage, but she knew that strength alone would not save him. "Then rest a little longer," she said. "You'll need all your energy." They spoke little after that. The tension outside seemed to seep into the cabin. Every sound, wind rustling the trees, the distant chirp of a bird, even the soft crackle of the fire, made Eliza flinch. Her instinct screamed that something was coming, and then she heard it. The distant sound of hooves hitting the wet ground, slow at first, then faster, stronger, deliberate. She froze, straining her ears. Daniel looked at her, his eyes wide with alarm. "They're coming," he said softly, though there was no doubt in his voice. Eliza's heart began to race. She moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. In the distance, through the trees, she could see them, 5 men on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the morning light. They rode with confidence, scanning the valley as though they owned it. "They're bounty hunters," Daniel whispered, his voice tight. "5 of them, they know I'm here." Eliza swallowed hard. She had expected danger, but seeing it approaching made it real in a way that words could not capture. She moved quickly to close the curtains, blocking their view of the cabin interior. She knew that if they saw him, even for a second, it could be the end. "They'll come to the cabin," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have to be ready." Daniel nodded, leaning against the wall for support. "I can barely stand," he admitted. "I need you to lead them off to distract them if you can." Eliza's mind raced. How could she possibly face 5 armed men with rifles and pistols? She was just a widow living alone in the mountains with no experience in fighting or strategy. But she knew she had no choice. Protecting him meant everything. As the men approached, she stepped outside, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. The sunlight glinted off the barrels of their rifles, and the leader, a tall man with a cold face, halted and raised a hand. "Good morning," he called. His voice was polite, but the threat in it was clear. "We're looking for Daniel Reed. We've been told he may be hiding here." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She forced a calm tone, masking the fear that churned inside her. "I haven't seen anyone," she said. "This is my property. You have no right to enter without permission." The leader, Marcus Hale, studied her closely, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "We have legal claim," he said. "He is wanted for crimes in this county. We are authorized to bring him in for the bounty." Eliza's voice remained firm. "No one has set foot inside my cabin, and I will not allow it without proper authority. You are trespassing." Marcus exchanged a glance with the other men. They were armed and confident, but they hesitated, uncertain how to proceed. Eliza realized she had bought herself a few precious minutes. Back inside the cabin, Daniel tried to stand again, grimacing in pain. "I can't stay hidden forever," he muttered. "They'll come inside." "Then you won't," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear. "I'll keep them outside while you get ready." She stepped closer to the leader, keeping her back straight and her voice calm. "You will not enter my home without evidence. There is no proof he is here. You are armed strangers trespassing on private property." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're bold for a woman alone in the mountains," he said, a hint of menace in his tone. "You could be making this very dangerous for yourself." Eliza didn't flinch. She held her ground. "And you could be making it very difficult for yourselves," she said. "Without proof, I will not allow entry. Go back to where you came from before the law sees you." Marcus signaled 2 of his men to approach the cabin door. Eliza's heart raced. Every instinct told her danger was near, but she could not panic. She had to remain calm to protect Daniel. Inside, Daniel tried to move toward the back door, but his strength was limited. His wound throbbed with pain, and he could barely take a step. He leaned against the wall, waiting for her signal. Eliza knew that a confrontation was inevitable. She needed to delay them to buy time for Daniel to escape or defend himself. She stepped outside again, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, and raised her hands as if in peace. "Please," she called. "There is nothing here for you. You cannot prove anything. You risk breaking the law yourselves if you continue." Marcus's face hardened. "We have every right. We have a bounty. We will find him." Eliza's mind raced. She knew she could not fight 5 men alone, not physically. But she could use words, delay tactics, and her knowledge of the terrain. The valley around the cabin was uneven, filled with trees, rocks, and hidden paths. She could move silently, create distractions, and keep them off balance. She began speaking quickly, keeping their attention on her. She pointed to distant hills, claimed she had seen shadows moving in the forest, hinted that Daniel had fled that way. The men hesitated, their eyes scanning the distance, trying to determine if she was telling the truth or lying. Inside the cabin, Daniel leaned against the wall, listening. He knew she was buying them time, and he understood the risk she was taking. He felt a surge of gratitude mixed with fear. If anyone else had been in her place, he might not have survived the morning. The tension outside grew as Marcus's patience wore thin. "Enough games," he called. "We will search your property." Eliza's heart pounded. She knew that if they entered, they would find Daniel immediately. She had to act. She moved closer to the door, speaking loudly enough to keep their focus on her. "Wait! If you enter, you risk entering illegally. You need permission from the sheriff." Marcus's eyes flicked to the horizon, then back to her. "Where is this sheriff?" he demanded. "You don't know," she said quickly. "He is on his way. You'll be in trouble if you don't wait." For a tense moment, the men froze. Their authority was absolute in their minds, but they were not lawmen themselves. Without proof, they were trespassing. Eliza realized that every second she gained was critical. Daniel moved slowly to the back door, leaning heavily on the wall for support. He could barely stand, but he knew he had to be ready if the hunters forced their way inside. Eliza's distraction had given him enough time to position himself, ready to defend or flee if necessary. The bounty hunters were frustrated. They had expected a quick capture, but the woman in front of them had slowed their plans. Marcus signaled a hand, and two men began approaching the cabin again, carefully this time. Eliza stepped outside, standing firmly between them and the door. "If you step closer, you risk consequences," she warned, keeping her voice calm. "I will not hesitate to call the law." Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he hesitated. He knew that forcibly entering the cabin could bring trouble, and Eliza's courage made him wary. The other men grumbled, shifting uneasily. Suddenly, a distant sound interrupted the standoff, the clatter of horses' hooves on the road farther down the valley. Eliza's heart leapt. Another presence was approaching, but who could it be? Marcus glanced toward the sound, uncertainty flashing across his face. "What now?" he muttered. Eliza kept her voice calm, forcing him to focus on her instead of the cabin. "You hear that? There is someone coming. If you do not wait, you risk confrontation with the law." Marcus cursed under his breath, looking to the other men. The sound grew louder, shoes on dirt, wheels on stones, the unmistakable authority of law approaching. For the first time, doubt entered the faces of the bounty hunters. They had assumed they were in control, but now the balance of power shifted. Eliza held her ground, every word calculated to keep them at bay, every movement designed to protect Daniel. Inside the cabin, Daniel leaned against the wall, exhausted but alert. He knew that the morning was far from over, but for now, Eliza's courage had kept them alive. He could feel the tide turning, and hope flickered in his chest once again. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. And in that moment, Eliza Harper understood the truth. Courage alone could not protect them, but cunning, quick thinking, and unwavering resolve might just buy them the chance to survive the day. The valley was quiet again, but the tension in the air had not lifted. Eliza Harper stood outside her cabin, heart racing, as she watched the 5 bounty hunters pause in the distance. Their leader, Marcus Hale, cursed under his breath, frustrated by her clever delays. Every second counted. Inside, Daniel Reed leaned against the wall, muscles aching, but his eyes were alert, watching every movement through the window. Then, far down the road, a sound cut through the valley, the unmistakable rhythm of horses on dirt. But this was different. The riders moved with purpose and authority. The bounty hunters turned their heads, unease flashing across their faces. Eliza knew immediately who it was. She had called for help before, praying someone in the town would notice the strangers in the mountains. And now hope arrived in the form of the sheriff. Minutes later, the sheriff and 2 deputies appeared, riding steadily toward the cabin. They wore the familiar dark hats and badges of the county law, and their horses moved with a disciplined calm. As they approached, the bounty hunters grew visibly tense. They had assumed control, but the sheriff's arrival changed everything. Marcus stepped forward, raising a hand to halt the others. "We're hunting Daniel Reed," he said loudly. "We have every right to." "You're trespassing," the sheriff interrupted, his voice firm and authoritative. "Without legal documentation, without proof, you have no right to enter private property. Step back." Marcus's jaw tightened, and his men glanced nervously at each other. They had never been challenged like this. The sheriff dismounted, walking toward the cabin slowly but confidently. "Step aside," he said again, directing his words at the bounty hunters. "I am the law here. You will follow my orders." Eliza felt a surge of relief, but she did not lower her guard. She knew Marcus was dangerous and would not leave without a fight if he believed the money was at stake. She quickly moved to the cabin door, signaling Daniel to stay calm. Inside, Daniel straightened as best he could. Pain shot through his side with every breath, but he knew the sheriff's arrival could turn the tide. He carefully reached for the small bundle of papers he had hidden in his coat. They contained evidence of the corrupt railroad investor who had framed him, the man who had caused the bounty to be placed on his head. These documents were his only proof, his only hope to show the truth. Eliza noticed the papers and nodded subtly. "Wait," she whispered. "Let them see it the right way." Daniel stepped outside slowly, supporting himself against the wall. He faced Marcus and the remaining bounty hunters, his pale face and worn clothes making him look smaller than he was. But there was strength in his stance, a quiet confidence that came from knowing the truth was on his side. "I am Daniel Reed," he said, voice firm despite his weakness. "I have been accused of crimes I did not commit. The bounty on me was placed because of lies and manipulation. I have proof of the truth." He reached inside his coat and revealed the bundle of papers, holding them out. The sheriff stepped forward and took them carefully, scanning the documents. His eyes widened slightly as he read, and he nodded toward Daniel. "These are credible," he said. "This changes everything." Marcus's face hardened, anger flashing in his eyes. "That doesn't matter," he growled. "We have the bounty, that money is ours." The sheriff's hand rested on his revolver, not to threaten but to assert authority. "The bounty is meaningless if it is based on lies. You have no legal standing to take this man. Step back or you will face consequences." The bounty hunters exchanged uneasy glances. They had counted on easy money, but now the law was in the cabin and the evidence was clear. They had underestimated both the sheriff and the truth. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to step back, their pride wounded but their bodies moving away from conflict. Eliza watched carefully, ready to intervene if necessary. Her body was tense from the hours of fear and anticipation, but relief began to wash over her. Daniel, though exhausted, gave her a small nod of thanks. He had survived the morning because of her courage, and now justice was on his side. The sheriff motioned for the deputies to keep watch on the bounty hunters while he turned fully to Daniel. "You have been through a lot," he said, "but this evidence is solid. I will ensure that the accusations against you are withdrawn. You will have a chance to clear your name fully." Daniel let out a long breath, the tension in his body easing slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. I thought I was finished." "You are not finished," the sheriff replied. "You have survived and now the truth will follow." Eliza stepped forward, her heart still racing. "Will they come back?" she asked. "The bounty hunters? Perhaps," the sheriff admitted. "But without legal authority, they cannot take any action against you. You are protected, at least for now." Daniel looked at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I owe you my life," he said, "not just for saving me from the storm, but for keeping me safe from them." "You don't owe me anything," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "I did what was right. That's enough for me." The sheriff called his deputies and spoke to Marcus and his men, making it clear that any further attempt to capture Daniel would result in legal consequences. The bounty hunters grumbled but eventually mounted their horses and rode away, their shadows disappearing into the distance. With the immediate danger gone, the sheriff turned fully to Daniel and Eliza. "You have been brave," he said, "and clever. Hiding a man like this could have cost you everything, but you did it right." Daniel gave a weak smile. "I had a good teacher," he said, nodding at Eliza. She smiled back, though her body ached from the tension and fear of the morning. "Let's just hope the rest of the day is quieter," she said, brushing wet hair from her face. The sheriff nodded. "I'll stay for a little while to make sure the bounty hunters don't return and that the evidence reaches the right hands. After that, you'll be able to rest safely." The calm began to settle in the valley. Sunlight warmed the cabin and the land around it. The storm was completely gone, leaving only the soft rustle of the trees and the distant song of birds. It felt peaceful, almost unreal after the morning's chaos. Inside, Daniel sank into a chair, exhaustion overtaking him. Eliza brought him water and some bread she had prepared earlier, though his appetite was weak. She watched him carefully, making sure he did not push himself too far. For hours they remained like that, two people bound by circumstance, sharing a quiet space after surviving danger together. As the day passed, news began to reach the nearby town. The sheriff had confirmed that Daniel Reed had been falsely accused, and that the bounty hunters had no right to act. Rumors spread quickly, and the townspeople began to whisper not of a dangerous outlaw, but of a man who had been wronged. Eliza observed quietly as the world outside the cabin slowly changed its perception of Daniel. She realized that the stories that had frightened her for months were not the whole truth. He was not a villain. He was a man caught in a web of lies and greed. Daniel, for his part, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fear that had gripped him for weeks began to fade. He still bore the physical marks of his struggle, the pain from his wound, the exhaustion from fleeing, but his spirit felt lighter. He looked at Eliza, knowing he would never forget the woman who had given him a chance to survive. Days passed. The sheriff investigated the claims against Daniel and discovered the corruption of the investor who had caused so much trouble. The bounty was officially withdrawn, and Daniel was cleared of the worst accusations. While some people still whispered, most began to see him as a man who had suffered unjustly and survived through courage and resilience. Eliza returned to her normal life in the cabin, though the experience had changed her. She no longer felt as alone, knowing that her actions had helped save a life and restore justice. The fear and tension of those days remained in her memory, but it was tempered by pride and relief. Daniel eventually left the valley, though not immediately. He stayed long enough to ensure that the sheriff had all the evidence and that justice was truly being served. When he finally rode away, he paused at the edge of the cabin and turned to Eliza. "Thank you," he said simply but with deep meaning. "For everything. I will never forget what you did." Eliza watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet sadness. The valley returned to its peaceful rhythm. The birds sang, the trees swayed gently, and the sunlight bathed the cabin in warmth. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and looked around the room. The fire still crackled in the hearth, and the cabin seemed to breathe with her. She had faced danger, made a choice that could have cost her everything, and survived. She had shown courage and compassion, and in doing so had changed not only Daniel's life, but her own. The morning that had threatened her home had become a turning point, a sunrise marking the end of fear and the beginning of hope. And for Eliza Harper, it was a reminder that sometimes the bravest choice is simply choosing to do what is right. She sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her bones, and felt the quiet pride of someone who had faced the storm, protected a life, and seen the truth triumph over deceit. The valley was calm once more, but the memory of that morning, the storm, the danger, and the courage, would stay with her forever, a testament to the strength of compassion and the power of doing what is right.